Hello everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host Chad Booth. Today we are going to talk about rainy day funds. 2020 has been a big year that has driven home the point that governments need to have reserves for the unexpected. Now the state, for years, we've heard talk about a rainy day fund, but what happens at the county level? That'll be our discussion, and we'll start with a little bit of background.
Budgeting for the county can be a daunting task during the best of years. This year, with a global pandemic roiling the American economy, it's even more of a challenge.
What we've asked our departments to do is kind of use this year as a year of preparation. And when I say this year, I mean the 2021 coming up. Interestingly enough, things look really good right now. Using sales tax as an example, sales tax is actually up right now. One area that we really have to look at is in the tourism areas. That has taken a huge dip.
So what can a county do to protect its budget from a year like 2020?
Counties do have the ability to have a rainy day fund or a savings account, but there are restrictions based on how much we can have in those rainy day funds or in those savings accounts. And the idea behind that is we want to make sure that we're not overtaxing our citizens just to have a rainy day fund.
In counties with a taxable value of at least $750 million and a population greater than 100,000, that fund can be 20% of the total revenues in the general fund. Other counties in Utah can retain up to 50% of their general fund revenues in reserve. But maxing out the rainy day fund isn't something a county is doing in any single year.
You don't just in one year decide that you're going to have 50% of your general fund in there. It does take some strategic planning to either move that needle one way or the other as far as what you're going to do.
For large capital projects, there are some additional options for saving rather than bonding that you can find on our social media channels this week. When we return, we will talk about a proposal to allow counties, cities, and interlocal entities to have a slightly larger reserve. For the County Seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
We'll continue our discussion about rainy day funds and get into some of the particulars, find out how big the piggy bank can be when we return on the County Seat. Welcome back to the County Seat. We're having a conversation about rainy day funds in this very rainy day year of 2020. Joining us for our conversation is the head of governmental affairs for the Utah Association of Counties, Lincoln Shurtz. Always happy to have you on the show.
Thanks, Chad, for having me.
And joining us from District 30, West Valley City, hunkered down out there, is Representative Mike Winder. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, Chad. Good to be here.
We always are talking about the state's rainy day fund, and nobody ever thinks about counties. They just figure they'll have money from somewhere. But I've always been really curious about how you even approach the issue of collecting money, setting a budget based on what you anticipate collecting. And so how does the rainy day fund play into all of that?
I think one of the big questions that you have when it comes to rainy day funds is trying to figure out what the philosophy is of the legislature. And the legislature, as we've had this conversation for many years, has often been, we want to discourage as much as possible local governments from collecting more money than they would otherwise need for their general expenditures. And so there's always been this philosophy, if you can, keep taxes low, and we shouldn't be setting a mill levy rate on property tax or any of the other taxes that you impose to simply build a rainy day fund. It does run into some issues, right? In years like this, where especially local government services are counter-cyclical to the economy, meaning when the economy sours, that's usually when people are needing more local government services. It does become very difficult. When we're seeing down years, that's when we're seeing a huge growth in municipal service demands. And so from that standpoint, there is absolutely a need for the conversation. We certainly appreciate Representative Winder bringing this to the forefront of the discussion for this year, and it couldn't be more timely. A pandemic is certainly one of those counter-cyclical events that is going to have some impacts, not only on municipal and county finance, but certainly on the demand for services that are being administered by both cities and counties.
So, Representative Winder, would you take a minute and just kind of talk us through the status quo and how long that's been in place as far as counties go?
Sure, and Lincoln's exactly right. There's this tension in the legislature. We want local governments to be able to fund their needs, even in rainy days. But what we don't want them to do is to have tax levels so high that they have more money than they know what to do with, and they can just store it up, right? And so the current statutes we've had in place for a number of years And we really haven't looked at tweaking those formulas for a dozen plus years. And how it's spelled out today is if you're a large county, which the statute classifies as an annual budget of $750 million or more and a population of 100,000 or more people, then you can only set aside 20% of your annual revenues in your rainy day fund. The equivalent.
How do you calculate that?
They calculate that based on what your total budget is for that year and the revenues you bring in. You can't set aside you can't have a rainy day fund that exceeds that 20% amount.
Okay, so that's just based on is that based on tax collections from the previous tax year or budget projections for the
It's your
current year?
budget from what you've been doing.
From the previous year.
Okay.
So they look at your previous year and essentially say, this is the benchmark by which we're going to measure that 20% against. And it's important, the other distinction that's important on that is to make sure that it only applies to the general fund. So not to get into hyper-technical treasury terms, but we do run enterprise funds for capital expenditure projects, road construction, some of those sorts of things, or tourism. Those don't count towards the 20%. It's just your general fund levy, the money that's going into the general fund for general operations for the county or city.
Okay, so are there reserve limits set on those other sub-accounts as well?
That's always kind of been a little bit of, candidly, the workaround. So you could always store money in your capital expenditure fund, and the thought being that road construction's expensive. We should allow you, especially the very small jurisdictions, to build up money in those capital expenditure funds. But it is candidly a workaround, and I think what we're trying to do is play straight and say we don't want to have to work through the workaround and put money into this capital expenditure fund and then do budget transfers in order to make things work. Let's just have an honest conversation with the legislature about the need to have additional rainy day funds in these times of kind of pandemics and natural disasters that we don't necessarily expect.
So if you have piggy little number one who builds their budget out of straw and they don't really concern themselves with what's coming down the road, they may not opt to try and do a rainy day fund or pay much attention to it. I guess my question is there a threshold on the other end of saying, well, you're going to at least have to put this much so you don't bounce checks? How does that work?
You know, on that front, I think really what you have to do is have some faith and trust in your local elected leaders. They obviously have to have an open budget process. The public's often allowed to participate in those processes. And so it is going to be a conversation of the county elected officials to determine what the appropriate level of rainy day fund is. And that is a political and policy consideration that should be had in all counties to determine what they think their exposure is to these sorts of downturns in the economy that are unexpected.
But is there a minimum threshold at all?
There is no minimum threshold.
There is not a minimum. But what we're seeing is counties are responsible, at least in Utah, that they've been pretty responsible to have a bit of a reserve there. We're explaining how the statute calls out big counties and says they can only set aside 20%. All other counties can set aside 50% because obviously in real dollars, that swings a lot bigger in Paiute County than it is in Salt Lake County. My proposal is to bump it from the 20% for big counties and let them set aside 25%. And for the other counties, instead of 50%, let them set aside 65%. So we're not going hog wild here. So my friends at the Taxpayers Association and elsewhere should be okay with this, because in a year of a pandemic, it shows that absolutely to have a large county like a Salt Lake County or Utah County that can set aside a reserve of just 25%, that's a very reasonable request. And frankly, in tight years like this, really comes in handy.
Well, I think what's also important when we look at it in years like this is to remember who's providing services. You know, when we've been watching our TV screens around the pandemic, most of who we've been seeing has been the governor coming out and talking about the new health orders and the new health mandates. The boots on the ground, the guys that are actually enforcing the health orders, administering the health orders, the ones that will be responsible for the vaccine management protocols, the ones that are responsible for managing the restaurant population, the gym population. All of that is borne by the county health department. And so the county has a responsibility in these circumstances to provide a health response. At the very same time they're being asked to provide a robust health response, they're seeing a reduction in the amount of money that they're getting in tax receipts because valuations of property oftentimes go flat in these times of kind of economic down cycles, and certainly sales tax has gone down. And so when we look at the decrease in sales tax, we look at potentially flat property tax revenue coming into the jurisdiction. At the very same time, we're seeing a huge increase in the demand for health services. That is the kind of the push and pull, if you will, of this policy consideration to say, how do we pay for these services when our budget really doesn't allow us to set any money aside for those types of service provisions.
Okay, I think this is a good point to take a quick break. We'll continue with the county seat. I want to go into some of the details of your bill, Mike, when we come back. Okay, we'll be right back on the county seat. We're talking about rainy day funds, and there's even sunshine outside right now. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat. We're having a conversation today about rainy day funds and the impacts that it has on counties and that balance we've talked about so far of, well, you don't want to like overtax for something that may never come, but you want to be prepared. So, Mike, what was your motivation for trying to address this and change those numbers?
You know, my day job is I work for the city of Mill Creek. And so I see firsthand that the cities are facing this similar issue. Many of you in the county world know my big sister, Amy Winder Newton, who's a Salt Lake County Councilwoman. As I visited with her, she said the counties are facing similar issues. And it just seems like all the way across the board, even different interlocal agencies and others are saying, hey, it doesn't make sense that our hands are tied from how much we can save for a rainy day. It's I wouldn't say anti-American, it's anti-Utahn. We're taught in Utah to save for a rainy day. We do that at the state level. We have our rainy day funds, and yet we kind of tie one hand behind the backs of our local governments when it comes to this. And we don't want to go hog wild and just take away those provisions. And frankly, that wouldn't pass the legislature anyway. But it certainly makes sense after this pandemic year to say, hey, how can we bump those up even just a little bit to give a little more breathing room in preparation for future disasters and future pandemics?
So for like a Davis County, they'll probably fall into that 750 million, 100,000 plus category. Does a 5% boost in their ability to set aside for a rainy day really make that much difference?
Sure. I mean, if you go from 1/5 of your budget, 20%, to 1/4, 25%, it helps. There's some who say, man, maybe we should be able to set aside 50%. But I think what the 25% is it's a reasonable compromise with the different forces at play here.
What happens, you know, I look at this and I look at historically some of the counties that have had boom or bust economies, and then all of a sudden their floor falls out. It could be like the major source of tax from a waste facility goes away, or, you know, mineral extraction royalties go away. And it looks like, you know, they've got a period that's longer than a year to try and set this aside, but the revenues are going to drop. How do you calculate for that, or is that just, you know, how would you do that?
You know, it's kind of interesting sitting here and having this conversation with Representative Winder. As he mentioned, he's in the business of economic development for a city here in Salt Lake County. But the same is true throughout the state. Economic development has really been the way in which many of these boom or bust economies are trying to figure their way out of this dilemma. So if you're talking about Carbon County and kind of the reduction of the reliance on coal and their need to pivot to a new economy, that takes time. And economic development often takes time. And through that, you better make sure that you're at least getting some revenue to get you through the transition in economy. The same could be said of the boom or bust economy out in the Uinta Basin. Something needs to be done to make sure in these kind of economic shifts that we're seeing in our state that there's an opportunity for those communities to work themselves through the shift. And certainly a rainy day fund is a part of that strategy. And, you know, as Mike had mentioned, or Representative Winder had mentioned, we have often been taught both personally as well as a state in the Be Ready Utah program that we need to plan for these natural disasters. We always hear the big ones coming, right? The one place that we haven't really had the focus has been on what are we doing as local governments to make sure that we're also prepared. We're trying to prepare the public and make sure the public's aware, but certainly a conversation around what are we doing as local governments is timely. Certainly with the pandemic, it brings it to the forefront. I have presented the legislature 3 times this year already on what are the strategies of local governments around preparedness for natural disasters. And so certainly this is one. It's a unique one. A pandemic is not what we expected, but it certainly has highlighted the issue generally around the concern of major disruptions to your economy.
With some of these dedicated funds, is a county that's really concerned about something like this able to kind of leverage those percentages a little bit by moving stuff off into dedicated funds like capital improvements?
Certainly, they are. So you can do the capital improvements, but again, most times local governments are using their capital improvement fund for that, for capital improvement. And the question becomes, what do you do when you have to raid your capital improvement fund to provide general governmental services? Well, all that's doing is delaying infrastructure investment, which is counterintuitive to an economic development strategy that I just talked about. And so, to a certain extent, sure, you can raid the rainy day fund, but it's kind of like raiding your reserves that you use to maintain your own home, right? At some point, you got to maintain your own home and refill those reserves. And so robbing Peter to pay Paul probably isn't the best strategy for our governments to manage their finances. And I think that's what Representative Winder's been trying to point out with this bill.
Well, I am, and we have some counties who even today aren't saving up for the rainy day like they should. And we have others that are at the top of that threshold, the 20% or 50%, that could use a little more headway. And so hopefully what this conversation does is those who are already saving as much as is allowed by law are then allowed to save a little bit more and be even that much more prepared for the next hit that they would get. And those who aren't, maybe it's a good reminder that, hey, counties, always set aside a bit for a rainy day and try to maximize that account under law so that you are prepared for, if you're an energy economy that rises to booms and busts, you can weather it. If you're a tourism economy, we've seen in Grand and Summit how COVID's really hit them hard this year. This would help you ride that better. And so this is a prudent measure, as we like to do at the Utah legislature, to help our local governments better prepare for the next downturn.
Great. Well, while we keep circling around the pandemic, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about how the picture has been changed with the $3 trillion of CARES Act money that's been infused into the economy and how that fits into this. We'll be right back with the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We're having a conversation today about rainy day funds, and we got to a point where I do have a question. You know, Mike, you talked about Utah values, that it is a Utah value to be prudent and prepared, and but there's also a Utah value that a lot of people wear boldly on their sleeve about government being frugal, and we're supposed to be frugal, not buy the big Cadillac, buy the Chevrolet. So how do you resolve that cognitive dissonance that comes from this?
Well, I think that's why we're trying to get these percentages just right, and it is a bit of a fine tuning. If all we cared about was frugality, we wouldn't let the governments hoard any money. Darn it. Do it all in tax cuts, or use it or don't use it. On the other end of the pendulum, we would say, hey, if we're really saving for a rainy day, man, let them save 100% of their revenues. 125% of their revenues. Let's really build up that rainy day fund. And the answer is somewhere in between, right? And so for big counties to be able to save a quarter of their revenue is not, to me, out of the question. And for smaller counties, 65% is not out of the question. So I think we're striking that right balance with this tweak in the legislation.
Well, I think the important distinction that I don't know if we've made clear is it's not a quarter of your budget every year. It means you can carry over a quarter in the aggregate. So in any given year, you can have a quarter of your budget in reserves. So this does not have a compounding effect where every year you're adding an additional quarter. It is simply saying you can have up to a quarter, whatever your budget is, but that's kind of the top threshold. That does not compound, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so, but that raises another question. You get, we'll go back to Uintah County. They had just way unexpected when oil went up so much, they had all this money on their hands that they didn't really plan for, and so they had surplus. And then the next year, they have nothing. They could only save a rainy day. It would probably even help if it could be on like a 5-year average. But
yeah, and we have talked about that as well. I mean, we've talked about a bunch of these different scenarios, and I think Representative Winder is correct. It's a balancing act. It's trying to find that kind of fine-tuned middle ground of being both frugal and prudent with our expenditures and the way in which we're approaching this issue. As you mentioned, leading into the break, we have $3 trillion nationwide in the economy that was infused by the federal government. I don't want to say it's fake money, but it is not money that naturally generated out of the economy. It was money that was provided by the federal government. In Utah, it was just over $1.2 billion that came to the state of Utah. That is artificially propping up both business and government. It is allowing us to provide the governmental services that you're experiencing today. For instance, the Sundance Film Festival is not going to look anything like the Sundance Film Festival of years past. That brings in $110 million a year to the state of Utah. Well, when it looks different this year, that's going to bring in far less tax receipts, whether that be in tourism dollars or sales tax dollars. And with that, what do the park cities and the summit counties of the world do when they lose $110 million worth of economic activity in this year? Having some kind of rational discussion around rainy day funds is absolutely appropriate at this time, recognizing the major shifts we're seeing in the economy.
Do you think that part of that is going to be a harder sell to make to the general public because that $1 trillion is floating around in the Utah economy and they haven't really felt how bad it is?
I think Utahns are smart. I think they know that this has been a year unlike any other. I think they know that there's been enough impacts in their personal life and their personal budgets to know that, hey, our local governments need to prepare better for their rainy days as well.
Excellent. Any last thoughts? We got about 30 seconds left.
Chad, I appreciate you bringing up this kind of wonky issue. It is absolutely important. It does have an impact on the way in which we provide services. So thanks to Representative Winder, and thanks for you for highlighting this issue on this episode.
Really appreciate the Utah Association of Counties partnership with this and the county seat for getting these issues out there.
Thank you for joining us on the show. Thank you for joining us in the audience. Remember, local government is where your life happens. Share this with your friends. Let's have this discussion further than just this half hour. We'll see you next week on The County Seat. Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.